Hello, viewers. Today, this is going to be a special podcast. And my guest today, you're going to understand a lot about him only through the conversation, perhaps, because there's a lot to speak to him. And the guest is Mr. T.R. Raghunandan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You were an IAS officer, from an IAS officer to almost an activist.
Yes,
But people say you were an activist even when you were an IAS officer.
shouldn't be saying that officially, but borderline activist too.
Okay. But people would still want to recognize you more as a former IAS officer than an activist, because in this country, if you were a babu, you remain a babu.
Yeah, that's sad actually, but yes, that's true.
And that's also perhaps very feudalistic,
Yes, very much so. Very much.
because people like power, even if they are oppressed.
Yes, absolutely. That's a scary part about this.
So if you're into public policy, you would be very carefully looking at it and also retrospectively.
Yes, in a sense, yes, very much.
And when you understand bribery and corruption and a kind of delinquency in the system, so do you actually bring all your experience and exposure in the public domain as a public service officer?
Yes, of course. Of course, one does it because most people have plenty of misconceptions about corruption. And they get despondent. They believe that corruption is a moral disease and therefore it cannot be cured. So very often I come across this hopelessness in people that corruption is something that is in the DNA of Indians and it can never be erased and so on, so which is completely wrong. That is not so the case. If you look at empirical evidence.
You said people think it's like a moral disease, this corruption. But don't you think that people have almost reconciled to the fact that, they have to live in this corrupt system, society, and the dispensation?
Not really. Actually, what happens with corruption is that the bad stories get repeated. But there are good stories. There are stories of corruption being eliminated process by process. And we don't tend to look at that evidence. There are systemic ways in which we can control, regulate and eliminate corruption. And countries have done it, and India has plenty of successes to boast of.
Is it also that when an officer very emphatically tries to portray himself or herself as a non-corrupt officer, and then people think that he or she is corrupt, and that is when they become indifferent to it, and that is more dangerous?
Yes, you see, the problem with the IAS is that, and the problem with much of the administration is that we are supposed to be anonymous. We are not supposed to project ourselves, and we are supposed to be people who work in the background and produce good public policy. But sometimes the tendency is to play to the gallery, and the officers assume larger than life positions, and they take a moral stand, which is not really appropriate, because then what you say can happen, that a person projects himself or herself to be honest and then is later on found out to be corrupt.
So you're trying to say, or you would rather say that, officers have to just be themselves because they have a larger, goal to be achieved by just following their directives.
No, not really. You see, what happens is that, well, if you look at an IAS officer's career, and a person joins the IAS directly at the age of 22, 23 or whatever, retires at the age of 60, you're talking about a 38-year career. How many of these years are actually devoted to frontline positions? Probably the first 10 or 12 years.
And that's also very unfortunate because, most of these officers, when they are very immature in some of the cases and they are just getting into a relationship or marriage or, having children and things like that, they are in very, very important positions of power.
That's right.
And that's when actually they get the taste of it.
Right.
And they can't live without it after that. So they keep going after it. Or rather, trying to look for opportunities where there could always be that.
Exactly.
So maybe it should be, in fact, towards their retirement, they should be getting positions of absolute power, like being a magistrate or being a collector or something like that, where they could directly deal with the people.
Well, Well, it could be that. It could also be that you can move back and forth from frontline positions to policy making positions and back. But you see, the legacy which the IAS has inherited is from the ICS. And the ICS, because it was designed and engineered for a colonial power to rule over us, did give younger people unnatural flexibility and unnatural levels of power. And we haven't taken away from that. The reason is that they felt that an enlightened outsider, even if inexperienced in the ways of the country, are probably loyal and professional, or they serve colonial interests.
And would be more aggressive with also the blood of the youth.
Yes, and that position, that attitude is assiduously cultivated, and it is handed over like an heirloom from generation to generation.
Okay.
So I would go so far as to say that the bureaucracy, and particularly the IAS, is the least changed institution since independence.
But what I've actually noticed is that some of the officers, even if they want to be, like you say, anonymous or just do their job, because the politicians want to have a good relationship with some of these senior officers, because they can actually get their jobs done and do it correctly, if at all, even if they want to be corrupt, that they want good advisors among these senior officers.
Yes.
They too cultivate some of these officers.
Yes.
Whether the officers want to be cultivated or not.
Yes, that has happened.
And most often we just look at this financial corruption. We just talk about bribery, but when they are morally corrupt, when this very idea of rectitude, moral high ground, and all these things could actually corrupt you morally, and which is more dangerous perhaps than just being somebody after bribes.
Yes and no. Let me talk about where I agree with what you say, but I would also say that we must be careful about generalizations. You see, the point is that I wrote this piece where I said that officers fall into 4 or 5 categories, and the most blatant officers involved in corruption are the takers. I mean, they just demand. They demand and take. But today, I think things are not so brazen as they were in the past. You cannot demand from somebody because people have changed. People tend to hold you accountable. So there are no more people who demand and get what they want, unless they put somebody in a corner. And that person, for that person, it's a matter of life or death. And then you can demand a bribe and take. So there are the demanders. Then there are the takers. They will never ask you to give anything, but they will take whatever is given, and they also take in kind. What might be given to you might not be a pecuniary advantage, but it might be a favor done to your children. There's a lot of this kind of the favors being done which are indirect, because it's harder to trace. You might favor somebody in a contract and end up with your child being recruited into that company and earning a fat salary. Or you might be given a share option.
Or an apartment.
Exactly. So those are the takers. And then you come to the third category of people who are, what you said, the intellectually corrupt. They are very careerist. They do not take money, but for them the drug, what they require is power and influence.
And that could be dangerous.
That could be dangerous because you take an amount.
Money, it's just the money. If somebody can't pay you, they can't pay you.
They can't.
But here, you could actually torture people mentally. You could demean them. You could put them down. You could just have that, the very pleasure of high-handedness to be able to, make somebody else's life miserable, even without expecting something from someone.
That can happen. But also what happens is that many, I think, officers have realized that whatever the political dispensation, regardless of the ideological position of the political dispensation, they want people like this. So I have seen officers, the biggest mistake that an officer can do is to be identified as close to a political party. Because if the other party comes to power, then you are thrown out.
But if you see in Karnataka today, those people who almost wore saffron clothes during the BJP seem to have completely shed it now for these people. The kind of ideological shift, not even the politicians, even if somebody was in the BJP and joined Congress, it may be a little difficult for that person to accustom to the ways of the Congress. But here, people say the officers overnight.
Yes, but
even with their ideology, thinking, their words, their but what do you say? Attitude, literally everything.
Which proves my point that to be intellectually dishonest is far easier. And people are very careerist. And they do not want to be thrown out of contention. And so they switch positions. And politicians need collaborators. Well, there is a tendency towards building...
Because it's almost like, look, be good to me because one day I come to power that I need you and you could be with me and it's going to be a good collaboration.
Yes. Collaboration does happen. But again, this is a pattern that is actually predictable. And this has happened in many countries in the past. And things have gotten better from there. So I would still be optimistic and say that these are all part of the growth pangs of a nation.
But don't you think that we've actually gone much past it? Because we should have by now corrected ourselves. With the way things are going today, it looks like it's going to take much more time.
If you look historically, that doesn't seem to be true. Let me just give you an example. If you look at the most powerful democracy today, which is the United States, between 1860, when the end of the Civil War, until the 1930s, when the Great Depression hit, it was the most corrupt place on the planet. And that was 100 years after they became independent. So for 60 years, after they completed their first centenary, they were the most corrupt country in the planet. Why? Because certain circumstances came together that enabled corruption to flourish. Number one, there was huge economic growth. Number two, there was a gullible population coming in, immigrants coming in and being promised wide open spaces in the West. So the corruption began with senators tying up with land sharks, tying up with railway companies and tying up with barge companies, selling land, selling dud shares and so on and so forth and cheating the gullible. And this went on for 60 years. It only ended with the Great Depression because the Great Depression was such a great economic slump that people could not afford the cushion to pay a bribe. And that is the time when actually, they cracked down on the mafia and they began to establish anti-corruption institutions with teeth. If you look at ourselves, if you look at us, the pattern that you see in Karnataka and in Bangalore, because Karnataka is a peculiar state in the south, in the sense that it has one large growth center, which is Bangalore. Unlike, let's say, Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu, which is a multiple growth centers. So the situation in Bangalore actually parallels the situation in the United States during that period. Okay. This is an expanding city. This is a city of opportunity. There are huge numbers of migrants who come in who are just transactional. They just want to live a better life than the life they were living. It
doesn't matter whether you're corrupt, whether the system is bad, nothing.
They have made an economic calculation to say that with the cushion of a bribe, I am still going to make more than what I would make if I were sitting elsewhere in the country. Okay. So we are passing.
A moral compromise.
It is a moral compromise, but I do believe that it's a transient compromise because it is playing out to a pattern.
So, but in the society where it is completely devoid of morality, in the sense, today we have questions about, what's the kind of God that you worship, to what's the kind of God that you would associate with spiritually. Because when there is this flux that you're continuously, you are rediscovering yourself as a society, in the sense, you start changing your benchmarks from day to day, perhaps also. But you look at an incident and you say that I'm this, and the next day you say I'm that. You look at some price rise and you say that, I'm with these people. And you look at something else and you say I'm against that. So with something like that, do you think we can actually compare this to the 20th century, US, early 20th century US? Because I think that we have advanced ourselves because it's not the kind of a country where people did not know things. Today, people are just aware. Everybody is aware of what corruption is, what corruption can do. It's not something that they're going to realize one day. They know what happens if it's abolished. A lot of people don't want corruption to be abolished because it's very convenient. Because I've even heard some, business people who say that, that person is a good officer, but what kind of a good officer? He doesn't take money. You got it. He doesn't do anything. We would rather have a person who would take money and do the job, and this fellow sits on a file. It's neither good for him nor for us. So if people have already started giving treatises to describe the whole scenario of corruption, I don't think that it could be an exact comparison between what America was in early 20s to what India is in early 21st century.
No, I would not be so pessimistic. Why? The reason why I say that is the argument that corruption is a lubrication to keep an economic engine going has been around for decades. It's not something that is new. And it might be partly true. There are a whole lot of game theories which are outside the scope of my discussion. I actually do training classes on anti-corruption where I take people through a
You were involved in I paid a bribe.
Yeah, I was one of the people who started it. So, when you do the game theories, you realize that there are instances where corruption is actually the grease that keeps the economic engine going. But almost inevitably, worldwide, in many situations, there comes a time when two systems compete with each other, and then the bribe becomes the one that drives inefficiency in one system and makes it less competitive. We haven't reached that stage. We will reach that stage.
It's become worse.
It will become worse. It should become worse. It will become worse. But the politicians in this country are very smart. They never allow something to deteriorate to a complete anarchy. So, in spite of all that we say about corruption, there are brilliant examples of where corruption has been eliminated in Karnataka. So in Karnataka,
in some cases, even with the intervention of politicians themselves, because, like you say, because they don't want it to go to that tipping point.
Very much so. Let me give you two examples. 20 years, if you go to the commercial taxes officer in Karnataka, and you look at the board of officers there, and what you will see is that a corrupt officer is posted, and then an outstanding officer is posted. Then a corrupt officer, then an outstanding officer. Because you don't need an outstanding officer in that department to clean up the system so that it can become, it can be milked. You cannot allow the commercial tax office to completely collapse. So you cannot post two corrupt officers in succession. You need a good officer.
So what you're saying that there have been this consistent or rather intermittent efforts.
Yes. And also, if you see certain types of corruption have been completely eliminated. You remember the time when even a chief minister could not transfer the person sitting at the check post of the commercial tax in Attibele. Today, you can just drive through. Why? Technology has changed everything. There was a time when you could not do the same thing. In fact, in iPaidAbribe.com, we did a study of the number of transfers of sub-registrars in Bangalore city. And it told a great story. Everybody got a chance to make a killing. The transfers happened at every 6 months, and certain posts were more, obviously they generated more income, so there was hot competition for being posted. And I remember that there was an unprecedented situation of a lady who was posted to a sub-registrar, and then she was, I think, suspended or caught by the Lokayukta, and then she sat in dharna before the minister's house and demanded that the bribe that she paid must be returned.
Okay.
Right now we are witnessing a silent revolution in registrar offices. All the documents have to be filed online. Payments have to be made online. Of course, people still haven't got the whole gist of it. So there are people who are trying to sabotage.
Right, things like Sakala and...
It has actually slowly reduced corruption. Land record.
It's also true that, like you say, in some cases, maybe the efficiency also has come up in the government setup. Because to be pessimistic, that is being very bad, in fact, because, it's like completely negating the kind of efforts that have been made. But I've been watching myself that in some cases, the public sector, or rather the government offices, work much better compared to some of the private offices too. Because in some cases, a single officer would be, performing so much and dealing with so many people and giving more results than even a high-paid executive in a private setup. And I don't know that, how that kind of a change has been able to...
That is again, one cannot diagnose corruption or pass a judgment on corruption without understanding that corruption can be classified into different categories, right? So let me look at the most easy corruption to get rid of. which is this over-the-counter corruption. Like that is what we were tracking in ipayabribe.com. We tracked about 50 odd services. You could go to a drop-down menu and write your experiences there. So we looked at all the departments which handed over something, which had a citizen-facing interface.
Okay.
A ration card or registering a document or getting a driving license and so on and so forth, right? That is one level of corruption, over-the-counter bribes. Ultimately, this is bad politics. If you allow that to continue, citizens will turn against you. And I do believe that since the time that when I started ipayabribe.com until today, there has been a steady decrease in that level of corruption. Citizens' expectations are getting better and probably this will vanish, right? You come to the next level of corruption, which is not citizen-facing, but it affects the citizens, which is public procurements. That is the whole thing about the 40% Sarkara and before that the 10% Sarkara. So what a smart politician will do is just
interested in these small things.
Is transform the face of corruption, take it away from the public eye by delivering services to at the ground.
Be very prompt there and punctual there. And
but make your money in taking commissions on procurements.
Which is much more dangerous, larger, and nobody would even be able to see.
Because you are then going to suffer substandard infrastructure, but the bribe is not being taken from you. Yeah. The third level is even more difficult to catch, which is the selling of government assets. One is when government procures, the next is the selling of government assets, right? We've had so many scams here on land deregulation, mining and all that. That doesn't touch the citizens directly, but it affects the citizens' quality of life eventually. Then you have judicial corruption, or let us say regulatory corruption, where regulatory bodies, because there are quasi-judicial bodies, this is completely uncontrolled, right? You have private sector corruption. India does not even criminalize private sector corruption. You know, if you see the TCS case that just happened, yes, but that person cannot be prosecuted for corruption.
Yeah.
He's been sacked.
Yes, Deban.
Sacked.
That's all.
Sacked is not a criminal punishment, right?
You could go and find a job elsewhere.
And the most difficult kind of corruption to control is what is known as policy corruption and state capture. And that is the most difficult corruption to price out. So you will see a lot of Western countries. In fact, if you look at the Transparent Index, there have been huge scandals in countries like Sweden and so on and so forth. Vienna, places...
Almost coming to that, don't you think in cases where they've been able to regulate corruption or eradicate corruption, these countries are quite small? Because when we look at the size of the country, the kind of population that we are looking at in a few years, it's going to be completely impossible for ordinary people to get anything at all unless they perhaps use some influence or spend some money. It's like even a job to getting a permit, to getting a thing done, to whatever. Because even if, like you say, once again, it could be completely invisible because the number of people who are getting it done, they may not even talk about it. And the others may not even come to know about it. And that's going to affect everybody one day or the other. Because today you know that in spite of India growing economically, still the level of poverty is something that people don't even talk about because it's beneath their dignity to speak about the own poverty or misery that they are suffering, because they would all like to project themselves as middle class in spite of not even having enough money to perhaps eat and live a good life. So if at all they even borrowed money and paid somebody, they would rather, project it as they got it because of their God-given qualification or their ability or perhaps,
Well, I see, again, I would not...
No, but aren't you actually looking at this problem of population at all?
I don't think it's too much of a factor. Let me explain why. Regardless of the size of the population, right, it is possible for India to achieve a standard of excellence in the over-the-counter services kind of corruption. To take large countries...
But that's like you said, it's actually a small part of it.
Yeah, but
it's easier to actually control.
But you must remember that rooting out big level policy corruption is independent of the population of the country. It exists in the United States in a very big level. It exists in many small countries in a very big level. It exists in countries where you would least expect it to find. I must tell you this story. I once attended an international seminar. There is a place called the International Anti-Corruption Institute. It is just outside Vienna. And the most amusing thing was that every person, regardless of which country they came from, swore that their country was the most corrupt country in the world. And I was shocked when a government officer from Austria came and argued with me and told me that Austria is the most corrupt country in the world.
But surprisingly,
And I asked him why. I asked him why. And he recalled a whole story about corruption in the construction of Vienna airport. And I had just walked through the airport. It's a beautiful airport. But this is the whole point. At the highest level, there is very little to distinguish policy level and state capture happening in smaller countries or bigger
No, but I was quite surprised in Slovenia, which is an extremely small country with just about 20 lakh population, where people were openly talking about how the system is not corrupt at all.
There have
And as opposed to a country like the Czech Republic, where people are talking about the country was being run by the mafia.
exactly. If you similarly,
So that's not the case with India at all. At least here we are fighting it.
that is not the case. Similarly, if you look at Georgia and Estonia and compare them with, say, Ukraine or Kazakhstan or Tajikistan, there's a world of difference. Georgia rose to become the 4th cleanest country in the world in the Transparency Index. And they did a marvelous job. So there are these sparks of excellence here and there. And I think that with technology, you can actually upscale those expectations.
But is it also the problem with culture? Because in a country where people celebrate wealth, in the sense when you actually look at it as your good luck, good fortune, good karma to be able to live a good life, and where you continuously tell yourself that if you don't have enough money, that you are not fortunate enough, that you've been disfavored by your gods, and you've not done enough good karma to be able to have enough wealth, where even your horoscope, to your astrology, everything says that if you are to get some money, that you should have good karma in the past. Don't you think that, people think it doesn't matter how you make the money, but ultimately you made the money?
Well, there's a very interesting piece of research. This is an old book, and this book needs to be re-examined now. But this book was written in the 80s, where the author looked at culture and corruption. Because this is a popular argument that certain cultures are more prone to be corrupt. And the argument sounds very persuasive. But when he did his research, he found that on the margin, there might be a few differences. For example, in Switzerland, I teach in Switzerland. So when I go there, I once made the mistake of just taking some gifts for the professors in the university where I teach, and they were shocked. And they said that it has to be entered in the... And what was I taking? I was taking some perfumes and some soaps and traditional...
Isosceles.
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't accept it. Now in India, it's bad form if somebody comes to your room and offers you something during Deepavali, a box of sweets. When I was Rural Development Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Panchayati Raj, there was an old gentleman who was a minister in Himachal Pradesh, a very decent gentleman. He was 80 plus. And he was not poor, but he was not very rich. He had landed property. He had an apple orchard. And during Deepavali, he would pack a box of apples and he would send it to us from Himachal Bhavan. Can I say no to him? He would feel mighty offended, right? He was not asking me for a favor. So what I did was I would distribute it in the office. Right?
That was you, but not everybody else.
But the point is that those gift giving is a very Asian thing. In the West, it's still more structured. It's considered to be corruption. So it's very different. But apart from that, what this research did was it found that people across the world had a more or less clear understanding of what is right and what is wrong. So it is an area where a lot more work needs to be done.
No, because if somebody brings home the money that is like basically pelf, ill-gotten wealth, would object to that kind of money, saying that this is not the kind of money that we would like to live in. So, because I don't think that when we're talking about a society with morality or values of, dignity and things like that, but where would somebody say things like, this is the kind of money that I would like to earn, these are the limits that I put to myself, and this is where I draw the line.
This is an interesting point, and in fact...
Because I've actually seen people celebrating, saying that, he works as a sub-registrar, he has built so many houses, he has so many cars, he had his daughter married off in such a lavish way. And if people are celebrating wealth, like always Santosh Hegde would say, Justice Santosh Hegde, that the biggest problem in this country is greed, and you're celebrating greed because there is no stop to that. Because when you say that you need money, and you look at people and you feel that, like in Kannada also, when you call a rich person Dodda Manushya, a big man, that means you're a small person if you don't have enough money. It's not because of his qualification, it's not because of his position, but because if somebody has a lot of money, they become Dodda Manushyaru. So don't you think that itself is like ingrained in the minds?
No, not. I see. This is a very. I have seen in other countries this tussle, the tussle, or the friendly argument that you and I are having, where I am saying that it's a question of systemic, action to reduce corruption, and I've given you a few examples. And you tell me that no, it's something ingrained and you need to do something.
I'm just trying to explore.
But so the point is that this is an argument that is ongoing in many places. And while I am more of a systems guy, because I also feel that we don't explore systems so much. If we devote ourselves to the other side, we kind of adopt a defeatist attitude.
You're not corrupt because of lack of opportunities.
No,
because nobody gave you a bribe, or maybe you were not good at taking bribe.
No, but the point is, if you adopt that fatalistic attitude, then you are never going to solve the systemic problem.
But do people really want a solution to this problem? That's the biggest, because I've been speaking to a lot of people. It doesn't look like people really want a solution to corruption.
No,
like, for example, Let
me answer the first point. The first point is this question of whether it is a moral degradation, as you say, or whether it is a systemic problem, as I say. Let us say that the two of us actually define two poles, two different schools of thought. And by the way, this is an academic argument that has been going on in the anti-corruption literature for a long time. In practical terms, where I have found there is a little bit of both that combine together to produce a model where corruption is gradually reduced and eliminated. How does it work? There is an anti-corruption commission that actually works on reducing corruption in systems through two ways. Reducing the processes, making them transparent so that they are corruption proof. And number two, going after the corrupt and punishing them. That is one side. But the very interesting thing is that many of the anti-corruption commissions also has an outreach activity to schools, to colleges, through what we call moral education.
But that's very interesting. But for instance,
to actually tackle the point that you are making, the moral degradation.
It's exactly true, because these are the kinds of things even like somebody like Justice Santosh Hegde himself was doing, going to schools and speaking to students about how it was important for you to have a value-based existence. But then every day on TV that you watch a celebration of wealth, you watch celebration of pelf, you watch celebration of absolute inefficiency where people just have money for no reason. And all that they do is from morning to evening, they serenade from one end to the other of the house, and they make everybody else feel that I've been doing this because of good luck. So I wear better clothes, I need not work, I don't work in some, menial job, and I am more fortunate, or I'm better only because I have wealth, because I can afford things, and you don't, because you have to struggle. Your goal has to be to become like me, and doesn't matter how you do it. Either you marry into this family or you find some devious way. So how would you correct that? You go and do this in school, you come back home, you listen to something else altogether.
That's fine. The question is that you cannot in that situation sit back and believe that it is inevitable, because then you're going to hit anarchy at some time.
But don't you think that's the way we would repair ourselves?
You hit anarchy? Like V.S. Naipaul says.
Which other way?
Then let us look at the V.S. Naipaul way, which example, is that accelerate the decay.
Which?
That is accelerate the decay.
Maybe that's the only way to actually make it correct.
I don't know.
For instance, if you...
I don't know. I'm historically what you say has happened. In fact, you're seeing it happening in Russia.
Yeah, if at all you see...
You're seeing it happening.
You've actually seen it yourself, that in Delhi, after Modi came to power, that he tried to do a few things. For instance, in these executive blocks, I've forgotten which, it's Shastri building? Shastri Bhavan. That people are not allowed to take bags, and you're stopped, every building had an SP and you'd be checked, and you'd not be allowed to take anything apart from the files and things like that. But today, here that all that is gone.
You
If
see,
Modi couldn't do it with his kind of popularity and also the support he had, now it's a different matter. He's completing his second term. Who else could?
well, I would not comment on leaders. The point is that every leader tends to also play to the gallery and look at the vote bank at some period of time. So even the ones who claim to be honest and clean are not, because they have to be opportunistic to remain in politics. In fact, political corruption is something that is just not cured. It is just there's absolutely no regulatory system, and we've actually now endorsed it with the electoral bonds system. So it is a pretty dismal thing. So either there are three options. One is to actually slowly start improving, which is what I am seeing happening, regardless of which party is coming. The phase of corruption is transforming. The good news is that corruption across the counter is probably diminishing. The bad news is that policy corruption is increasing. The other way is to sit back and say that, well, this is a moral problem, this is something deeply wrong with Indian society, in which case then the solution is accelerate the decay. Let us implode. And then from that implosion...
When you're talking about, because you're into public policy, that when you look at the history of the country, perhaps a little before independence to what it is now, that we did not have a clear idea about what kind of country we wanted. We were just, struggling to come out of the clutches of the British. We didn't have a plan about how this large country was going to be governed. We just thought we would, because we had this, Mahatma Gandhi's ideas on one side, where you just thought that was going to guide, but a lot of people were skeptical about it. But at the same time, people thought things would just repair themselves, because everybody was in a state of excitement about getting independence. That was all what it was. But then you fell in a pit, because you did not know how to correct that endemic problem of finding a solution to your everyday problems, and that was not going to happen with the government.
I think that's a little unfair. I'll tell you the reason why. What about the Constitution? If you read today, it's a fabulous document. And in fact, if one really wants to understand the Constitution, one should actually read the constitutional debates. But regardless of the political position of some of the people who sat there, regardless of their ideologies, the way each person contributed in a democratic way, built the rationale, argued for and against certain clauses, the way the Supreme Court of India set certain precedents in the first decade of its existence was absolutely...
But that's what I'm saying.
And that is just a glue that is a glue that's holding us to.
Yeah.
It is still holding us. It is still holding us.
Where do you see the Constitution actually working every day, apart from perhaps the overarching ideals that we always speak about? But at the ground level, it is a different democracy. It's a different constitution. It's a different way of life. It's a different, public policy that we are looking at, which is basically so insular to regions, to communities, you can be what you want to be without even adhering to the, greater ideals of the Constitution.
But let's not average out the country.
Okay.
I'll tell you, there's a problem about averaging out the country, because then you tend to forget the champions. And there are champions everywhere. Now, I belong to Kerala. I moved here to Karnataka, and now Karnataka is my home. I would say I'm an Indian, multicultural. My wife is from UP, so we were all over the place. In 1967, I remember very clearly, when I was a child, hunger was a problem. Right? My father's relatives had land, they would cultivate something, but we couldn't even transport the rice that we were cultivating in Palakkad to Cochin, where we were living, because there were such tight controls. There was starvation. Kerala at that stage had 65% of the people below the poverty line, the same as Bihar. Today it's 0.4% below the poverty line. Kerala has other problems. Kerala has alcoholism, lifestyle diseases, lack of an industry, all that is there. But they managed to eliminate poverty. Bihar is at 51%. So if you look at, and Kerala, Malayalis complain all the time about corruption, right? And studies have shown that they are probably the least corrupt state.
One day I was
Which is
surprised
fine.
to see the kind of bridges they have built, the roads they have,
Yes.
the buildings they have.
Precisely.
They may not be megaliths, or
Exactly.
they're not the kind of buildings that you would extol for their beauty, but they're built so well, they're clean, and they're so strong. And I was just looking, in fact, I was asking people, some politicians in Karnataka, why can't you even have Kerala as a model for your building?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, and why did it happen?
Curbstones to the grading of the roads to go into the
drain.
footpath, to the drains, to everything seemed to be so perfect, which is like a model for the other states.
Exactly. There's no littering. I was there 2 weeks back. There is absolutely no littering.
No littering. And people are so well behaved.
But they complain. But they still complain because their expectations are set much higher.
Perhaps that is what having a certain amount of intolerance. Because India's biggest bane perhaps is tolerance and going.
No, I
Don't
think-
go about this.
But India's
Very
greatest-
ideal of.
But India's greatest asset, if you look at it from a very Darwinian sense, is diversity. With diversity, you can have cross-pollination. Let me just give you an example. We tend to always concentrate on the governance of at the state level. We discuss state politics. We don't go to the sub-state level. Now, during the lockdown, there were no officers going into the field, and the panchayats were left to do whatever they wished, and they did a marvelous job. So suddenly what happened was many of the training institutions began to use Zoom to connect the panchayats to begin to talk about what they were doing. And our State Institute of Rural Development, Abdul Nazir Saab State Institute of Rural Development in Mysore did it. The Kerala Institute of Local Administration did it. And I would listen to it because I can understand both Kannada and Malayalam speak. It was interesting that in Kerala, when they did this weekly talk about what the panchayats were doing and so on, suddenly a voice is heard saying, आप जरा हिंदी में बात कर सकते हैं आप, क्योंकि मैं तो पंजाब से हूँ और मुझे समझ में नहीं आता है कि आप क्या काम कर रहे हैं. And broken English is, I am an engineer, I am a panchayat sarpanch, I want to know how you are handling this.
Amazing.
Suddenly, there is this community of networked individuals coming up. So, I would always position India as not having a gigantic problem.
No, but isn't it also what Mahatma Gandhi was talking about all the time? Because I think that you have forgotten what the vision he had. Because when he spoke about Grama Swarajya to what we have today, because I think like what you're saying, the ideas, the values, the compulsion to do things because they are your people, all these things that you can see in villages. And I think for some reason, these big politicians come and spoil it all.
Yes, but this is, we will have to look at judging what Ambedkar thought about Gandhi's ideals. Let me just give you, Gandhi had lost interest. He was disillusioned by the time we got independence because partition,
Different, perhaps.
partition kind of destroyed his ideal, the violence and all that. So there's a very interesting book written by a disciple of Gandhi named Sriman Narayan, who later on became the governor of Gujarat. It's called Gandhi's Vision of the Indian Constitution. Gandhi wrote the preface, or he wrote the preface to the book, or the foreword. And what he said was very interesting. He said, I haven't read this book, but if Sriman Narayan has written it, I endorse everything in it. Signed signed Mohandas Gandhi in Noakhali. He was at that point in Noakhali trying to calm the people. In that book, Sriman Narayan explains Gandhi's vision of democracy. And you know what Gandhi had thought? That we must only have one election in this country. That we would elect our corporator if we were in a city, or we would elect a panchayat member if we were in a village. They would form a collegium who would elect the MLAs, and the MLAs would form a collegium who would elect the MPs.
Okay.
Now, Ambedkar rejected it. Ambedkar rejected that idea and created a somewhat competitive system where the MPs would also be directly elected, the MLA would also be directly elected, and the panchayat members and corporators would also be directly elected. What has happened with that is that we created a very competitive system where an MP wants to do what a panchayat member is doing, because people don't distinguish between which level does what. Right? And the funny thing, and this is the real irony, you know who implemented Gandhi's vision? You would not believe it. It was Ayub Khan. when he abrogated the constitution of Pakistan and became martial law administrator, he said all this Western democracy is not for us, and we will create a system called basic democracy, where the people would elect their local body members, and the local body members will become a collegium to elect the president, which will naturally be he.
Which is basically like a pyramid.
Like a pyramid. It has its severe faults.
Could be very practical too.
Very practical, but also
Never experimented.
We never experimented.
In a civilized society with a democratic environment.
Yes.
Perhaps Ayyub doing it was not the right thing for him to do, because maybe he was the wrong person to do it.
No, because
maybe we should have at least tried it once.
Well, Ambedkar did not enshrine that in the...
What was the reason? Because he was too influenced by the American Constitution, perhaps, apart from perhaps...
I think so. I think so.
Because his whole idea of this, republicanism...
Yes, exactly.
That's what I've actually seen. Because I think when people even talk about the British Constitution or even the German Constitution and the French Constitution, I see so much of American Constitution.
Exactly. And you know the reason?
Yeah.
See, we have about 190 countries in the world. Only 24 are federations.
Yeah.
And the federations could be as small as Switzerland, with a population less than Bangalore, which has got 26 cantons and 5,500 communes. 3 levels of government. Very complicated. It's like a tiny little Rolex watch, but it works perfectly. Extremely complicated. It's the entire federal structure in a microcosm. And you have the American Constitution, which again is a union of states, right? The Indian Constitution is not a coming together constitution. It was not as if we were all independent sovereign units which decided to surrender a bit of our sovereignty to a confederate government.
Yeah.
We are a holding together constitution. The Indian Constitution says India is a union of states, which Rahul Gandhi is accurately and correctly quoting it. He's not an anti-national by saying that India is a union of states. He's stating what is there in the Constitution. But the next clause in the Constitution states that by a simple act of Parliament,
that means it's not that they wanted to come. We made them.
We can make India a union of 2 states if we want. And we've seen how states have...
It's like that we never respected the states as they were.
Exactly.
It's because we wanted to call them states, we called them together and we said that you're going to be a union of states.
But this is called a holding together federation. Because historically...
But that's very dangerous.
It is, but I think...
By what the Constitution says.
It is, but if you notice one thing, there are certain things that I don't think the union government can turn back. Whatever they say about one nation, one this and one that, let us look at the fiscal, the carving up of the financial pie of the government.
Okay.
Right? Our states are very strong fiscally, if you look at the share. And the union government used to get around 50+%. The panchayats and municipalities got about less than 1% till the 12th Finance Commission, and the states got 33% or something. It was the 13th Finance Commission that increased the share of the states from 33% to 42%.
Okay.
And I must commend the fact that Modi, when he was Prime Minister, accepted that shift. And I think the reason was that before becoming Prime Minister, he was the Chief Minister of a state.
Yeah, so he understood.
And so he understood that a state needed that kind of money. So he, even though it caused fiscal hardship to the union government,
But has there
he
been,
allowed that to
has
happen.
there been this constant effort being done continually, like without a break at all, to somehow change the identity of the political structure in this country, basically for political advantages? And I think that only could help politicians to arrogate,
Yes.
power.
Yes. And
And it's not because of any interest of the country or because of anything else.
You
Because
can
they could
see
do
that.
with less effort, more things, and exert more power with something like that.
Yeah.
with the people completely losing identities in the process. And we're just going to be a big mass of people who would not know which way to go. At least now we think of going to Punjab. So tomorrow it could be like we could go to Punjab only perhaps to look at some things. It's not because we go to a culture or a different people or a different state to begin with.
So
once upon a time, going from Karnataka to Chennai, or rather Karnataka to Tamil Nadu, was a journey because you're going to a different state. Even when you cross the border, you felt like, going to a different place altogether. But now everything is getting not just assimilated, but like diluted.
Yes, I believe that cultural dilution is dangerous for the country. Simply if I may give an analogy from biology, it's like monoculture is dangerous for a forest. Right, you need biodiversity in a forest because it's only biodiversity that can create.
And that's bad for the economy also. There is nothing for people to get from anybody else because you have it all.
Well,
and there are these smaller or weaker economies within the country or the regions that could suffer very much. But today, I could go to Meghalaya and could be in awe of their baskets, to their dress, to their... because they are unique people and I want to buy it from there.
Yeah.
If I am going to have a small Meghalaya in Karnataka, I'm going to lose interest in Meghalaya.
Yes, that is a possibility, but I am again more optimistic. My optimistic view is that given the tradition in this country of a fiscal space for the state, which, as I told you, is now 44%.
But that's not a permanent decision because it could also change.
People will resist. States will resist.
People are not even aware these days because the very idea of nationalism, don't you think that it is allowing people to have very wrong priorities for themselves and also to identify themselves in a different way from what they originally were? I remember when I was very young, I used to talk to some of these estate laborers in Kodagu. And they didn't even have an idea of how large the state was because they were only worried about their house, the village, and perhaps the place where the shandy was held. That's all it is. And they were just happy. And they left everything else to the other people who are interested in going elsewhere. It's not that they're not heard of Bangalore, Mysore, and places like that. But today, everybody wants to talk about Delhi, Ayodhya, everything else, without realizing that they're losing the ground beneath their feet.
I think it's only a passing trend. Secondly, if you broadly look at the South, for instance, there is certainly a resistance. There is a resistance.
But South has always been different because, the North has been a different country, though with different states, because it's like one hegemonic entity, if at all you see from the past also. But the South has always been diverse.
So if you look at it, even the Northeast has been diverse, though of course now they're being swarmed with the money power that is coming else, and they are fiscally weak. The South can afford to be different and assert their cultural stubbornness.
Because once upon a time, at least a few decades ago, the North was not able to push itself, or rather, overwhelm anybody else. But now they are powerful too, because at least after so many years of being Bimaru, today the very Bimaru states have come down to lecture Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So that's actually a very sad story, and the politicians of Karnataka can't even talk to them about it, saying that, we did the babysitting for you for so long, and we gave you the vaccine and the feeding bottle, and today you grow up and you come and talk to us about how we have to run the state.
Yeah, this is going to be a battle that will play itself out. But the fact, I believe that the constitutional structure as it exists now, and the fiscal structure that is also born out of the constitutional structure, because it's a finance commission that is dictating how the kitty should be divided, is something that is so entrenched in the system that it will be difficult to dismantle it. And unless you dismantle it, you're not going to be able to push your cultural dominance agenda. Whatever you might do through music and art and the Ministry of Culture or rewriting history or all that and this whole building up of nationalism, it is not sustainable over there.
But I think in Nazi Germany itself, it was all tried to rewrite history, to bring in, these heroes from the past and all that. And the same society that may support something at some certain point can totally reject it too.
Yes, but there let me argue. Let me join you in your worries. Nazi Germany did not have the kind of social media instruments that are available today to propagandists.
Yeah.
This is mind bending. What we are seeing today is unprecedented in terms of its ability to deliver a certain.
It's like this. If somebody is talking about nationalism or religion or gods or even, specifically Hinduism, you need not know anything. You just have to be loud and you should be pelting your words at the other person, and you just have to subdue the person's views or opinions with the power of your lungs.
Yeah.
And that's all that you need.
Yeah.
And everybody thinks that you've spoken so well and you have a better point. It's like they say in ancient Sparta, the man who had the loudest voice won the argument.
Yes. So this is something that I worry about when we make comparisons about.
But the same instruments could work against the dispensation one day. And it just take one tipping. Don't you think?
That's
Whoever thought that the Wagner,
yes.
head would go against Putin?
Yes,
You
that
got
can
it.
happen.
And that's actually that's such a hopeful situation.
Yes,
for the whole world, that nobody thought at least it could rattle somebody like Putin, even if it was just for 36 hours. Don't you think so?
Yes, but the point is that personally I feel helpless because
I feel too.
one
A
can
lot of people are feeling helpless.
one cannot predict the outcome. This is stuff that keeps me awake at night.
But let me tell you, the biggest problem is that people who are feeling helpless are just happy being helpless. They resort to social media or perhaps some tools of the digital systems and go online and just express their opinions in an article or something. If they were to speak, if they were to come out, because they say if you have to build something, you have to get your hands dirty. And most of us don't want to get our hands dirty. You would keep it clean and expect somebody else to get their hands dirty.
And this is where I feel that walking with just ordinary people gives you a far more sense of hope in the country.
But that's why, isn't it, a lot of people say that, just join some party, a big party, and if you want to change from within. Why sit and criticize them?
Not even necessary to join a party. That's the point I would like to.
I've seen people that were not joined party, who have gone and spoken to, people in villages, but who have not done anything at all.
No, fair.
Apart from just having a sense of satisfaction.
Wait. I don't want to mention the NGO concern, but there are people in civil society who are today not taking an ideological position when they speak to people, who are just imparting knowledge about the Indian Constitution. You might have your ideology might be derived from certain factors that in your upbringing, etc., which nobody is going to change that. Just remember that these are some of the things in the Indian Constitution, and this can be transformative. And this is a move that is happening very slowly, coming up from below. Let me just give you an example, and this happened much before the kind of turmoil that we are seeing here. After I quit, I used to work a lot with the panchayats because I just believed that this is the most important thing in my life to do. So when I was working with a few good panchayats, we were talking about participatory planning. And we said, why don't you prepare a plan? And each of these panchayat leaders came up with a very, very scheme-oriented plan. They said, I will take money from this scheme and I will build this. I will take money from that and I will put street lights. I will take money from here. And it was all very tailored to how the money was coming to a panchayat. So a friend of mine and she and I thought about it and said, this is not going anywhere. This is like asking a bunch of officers, and these are not officers, these are elected people. They represent hopes and aspirations. So we changed the format. We said, forget all that. Let's do one thing. You prepare a Gandhian plan. And the Gandhian plan emerges from the 5 pillars of Gandhian thinking that on which the constitution is built. If I were to reduce the entire constitution to just 5 words, what were those 5 words? Satya, Ahimsa, Swaraj, Sarvodaya, Antyodaya, Satya, truth. So then Ahimsa, non-violence. Swaraj, independence, self-reliance. Sarvodaya, daya for everybody. And Antyodaya, extra daya for the last person. And we said, you think about this, and the next day they brought a plan. It moved us to tears because they were no longer looking at their world from the point of view of how government funding was
The
there.
Indian Constitution, more than a constitution, it's an aspirational document for India, isn't
Yes,
it?
yes.
It's
But
about
we've not
what it
communicated.
can be. But the politicians don't know. First of all, even about the Republican idea,
Yes.
which is perhaps the most important thing there.
Yes.
About, not these people becoming Rajas. That itself is forgotten because everybody talks about India being a democracy and not so much about India being a republic.
And not about India being a federal distributed leadership democracy. And forget about federal. You don't even talk about the 73rd and 74th Amendments. 30 years since we have passed them.
But it's so interesting, so much to speak, of course, so much more to discuss and so much more to learn. We should have more discussions like this.
Yes, I enjoyed that.
Thank you so much for coming to this show.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.